right.
All right. Well, the time is 12:02. So we'll go ahead and get started. Before we do, just a couple of quick notes about the logistics of today's webinar. All attendees have been set to listen only mode, which means that you can see and hear Jordan and I, but we cannot see or hear you. However, we do want to get your questions. So there are a couple of ways you can get those to us. If you go to the bottom of your screen, if you're on a desktop, you should see a chat icon that looks like a little quote bubble. And you might also see a Q&A button. You can use either of those to send us a message if, as we go through the presentation, any questions arise that you want us to address. I'll do my best to keep an eye on the chat box as we go, and we'll try to address questions. But if there's anything that I don't get to, as long as I've got your name in the chat, I can send you a follow-up email afterwards if we don't have time to get to it during the session. The other note is that we are recording the session today. So if you have to jump off early, or if there's something that you missed that you want to refer back to later, rest assured there will be a recording of the webinar posted to the CultureWorks website, cultureworks.org, by the end of the week. All right, without further ado, let me introduce myself. I am Karen Maynor. I'm the CultureWorks Grants Manager, so I'll be your main point of contact as you go through the process of applying for the Artist Opportunity Grant. And joining me today is Jordan Knepper, Executive Director of the Piqua Arts Council. Jordan, would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Didn't you just cover it all? I'm Jordan Knepper. I'm the Executive Director of the Piqua Arts Council. I served on the panel as a panelist for 3 years before I took over as the coordinator, or whatever crazy title Karen's going to give me for this. So.
Thank you, Jordan. Yes, so Jordan's here today to give you the perspective of someone who reviews the grant. So all those applications that you submit get reviewed by brilliant people like Jordan and the other grant panelists who make those final funding decisions. And Jordan, as he mentioned, has recently been promoted to panel chair or facilitator for last year's and this year's cycle. Awesome. All right. We have a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to go ahead and pull up my presentation here, and we'll get started. All right. So first, quickly, you probably want to know the organizations that are behind this program. So I already mentioned that I represent CultureWorks, but if you don't know a lot about us, we are an arts fundraising, grant making, advocacy, and service organization that serves the 8-county Dayton region. So we do a great many things in the community. And we partner with the Montgomery County Arts and Cultural District, who is the funder of this program. The MCACD is a special purpose unit of Montgomery County government. It operates very similarly to a school district or a parks district. It has its own board that oversees things, and it works to support, nurture, and develop arts and culture in the Montgomery County community. And one of the main ways that they do that is by providing public funding to the arts, both organizations and through this program to individual artists. And when we say public funding, we of course mean that these are dollars that come from Montgomery County residents' hard-earned tax dollars. So that's something that's very special. We're very thankful that we have a community that invests in the arts, and that we have county leadership in the MCACD and the Board of County Commissioners who see the importance of arts and culture and the impact that they have on our community. And thanks to them, this program is possible. So what exactly is this program? The Artist Opportunity Grant Program is designed to invest in individual artists in Montgomery County, to give them resources so that they can develop their careers as artists. For some artists, that means opportunities to create new works, and for others, it means professional development opportunities where they're going to complete things like master classes or mentorships, attend conferences, opportunities to meet with others in their disciplines and learn from them and hone those skills. For this year's program, we have $40,000 available from the MCACD, and that will be distributed in grants ranging from $500 to $3,000. Now, the amount of each individual grant is determined by the grant applicant. So basically, what we'll be talking about today is how you put together a project proposal. And once you know how much that project is going to cost, you're going to request that amount through the program. This grant program does always award funding in full. So if you request $3,000 and you're selected to receive funding, then you receive $3,000. That's a little different from other grant programs you might be familiar with, where we do award partial funding. For the purposes of supporting individual artists, we think that it's important to always fund in full, because while organizations might have some flexibility in their budgets and be able to come up with the difference if awarded partial funding, that's a lot more challenging for individuals. So we award in full. In order to be eligible to apply for an Artist Opportunity Grant, you do need to be a Montgomery County resident. Again, that's because this is publicly funded, so we want to make sure that the grant dollars are staying within the community that they're coming from. You do need to be at least 18 years old, although if you're younger, we do have a scholarship program that I would be happy to talk with you about. So feel free to reach out to me after the session if you or anyone you know might be interested in that program. And you also can't be a student currently enrolled in a degree or certificate program, including graduate studies. And most importantly, you need to be a professional artist. Now, sometimes that terminology intimidates people a little bit. So I just want to emphasize that when we say professional artist, we're not talking about demonstrating that you receive your sole income from your art or that it's your primary source of income. It has to do with demonstrating your commitment to your art and to your discipline. So the ways that you can do that are by showing that you have exhibited or published works in the past, showing that you're an active member of your artistic community. Maybe you have formal education in your field, or maybe you're self-taught, but you've pursued opportunities to learn through workshops and residencies and those kinds of things to develop your craft. All right, what is an opportunity? So when we talk about opportunities, again, we're talking about projects that an artist can pursue that are going to take their career to the next level. And this program is open to artists in all disciplines. So past grantees have been dancers, choreographers, musicians, writers, fiber artists, painters, you name it. So opportunity is going to be defined a little differently for each artist who applies. But in general, it should represent a meaningful step in your career. In other words, based on your current skill level and your current level of or past achievements, what makes logical sense for you to do next? Where do you need to grow? Whether that's in your technical skill as an artist, or maybe you need to develop another skill in something like business and marketing that's related to how you're going to get your art out into the community. Whatever it is, it should lead to professional growth. And for this grant cycle, it needs to be happening between January 1st and December 31st of 2022. Some really common examples of the types of things that work well for this program are opportunities to complete workshops and residencies, to create new works. We love to see new exhibits and new albums, new theater productions come out of this program, and we've had many artists use the funding in that way. Or maybe the opportunity is something like auditioning for a major dance or theater company. It's a great opportunity, but you have to find the funding to get there. So this is a program that can help you cover those expenses. There are a few things that are ineligible, and I'm not going to go over all of them in detail, but I highlighted a few that are kind of the frequently asked questions that we see every cycle. And I do encourage you, we have a full programs guideline or program guidelines document on our website that as you're going through your application and as you're thinking about your project, you'll want to look at that closely and just make sure that all of the items that you're considering using grant funding for are eligible costs. But these are a few in particular to keep an eye out for. So because this is a project-based grant program, in other words, you're applying for funding for something that has a specific start and end date, it can't be used for ongoing work or supplies for general use. So to give you an example, you could apply if you want to create, say, a new exhibition of paintings, and you want to apply for grant funding to offset the costs of your paint and canvas supplies. But you couldn't apply for grant funding to purchase paints and canvases for an unspecified reason, just for your kind of daily use and work as an artist. Related to that, you can't apply to use grant funding for equipment that costs more than $500. Once you get up into that bigger dollar range, we're talking about what are called capital expenses, which are investments that you're making or purchases that you're making for things that you plan to use for the long term. And so sometimes we'll see requests for things like funding to buy a new laptop or a really excellent camera for someone who's working in photography. And while we recognize that that type of equipment is extremely important to your craft, because it isn't time restricted, it's for ongoing use, it isn't eligible for this program. One note about that, though, if you do have a project where you know you're going to need access to certain types of equipment that you don't currently have, you are allowed to use grant funds to rent that equipment. Because again, if you're renting it, that indicates that it's to be used on a temporary basis. So that's okay.
Can I also clarify just for a second? So Karen did an excellent job explaining that you cannot just purchase random supplies to be used in your work. But that does not mean you have to use every bit of paint, there may be leftovers or whatever. So it's not exactly, you're going to tell us how many pieces you're going to create for an exhibition. And so we would want to see so many canvases for that. We want to see, but if you have leftover items from that, that's okay.
Yes, we won't come and seize the canvases that you did not use. But yes, Jordan's exactly right. As you're putting together your project budget, which we'll touch on later, you'll want to think about some of those cost estimates. How many of these supplies do I really think that I'm going to need? Very good point. And then these last two, not using the funds for commercial or commissioned work or for curatorial projects. These are kind of related because the idea here is that the opportunity grant should be something that is going to help you grow as an artist. And while a curatorial project might do that, the focus is really there on showcasing the work of other artists, where we want the project to be something focused on your work as an artist. And commercial or commissioned work, so that's work where presumably there's another person or a company who should be paying you for that work as an artist. That would be a pretty clear example where that funding should be coming from that entity and not from grant funding. So those are some things to keep in mind. We do get a lot of questions about teaching opportunities, and we sort of tie this to this idea of commissioned work. If you are a teaching artist and you're interested in doing work in classrooms, that's a situation where ideally the school district that you want to partner with should be paying for that artist residency. But we also know that a lot of schools have limited funds, so that's not always easily done. So if that describes you and you're interested in learning about how you could get funding for an artist residency or other teaching opportunity, reach out to us about one of our other grant programs, the Special Projects Grant, because that is one where schools can actually apply to offset costs related to bringing artists into the classrooms. So something to keep in mind. All right. A little bit more just of the nuts and bolts. So the timeline for this program is that you have until October 8th to apply. The full application is completed online, and we're going to go through some of the major parts of it today so that you feel really confident and know exactly what to expect if you haven't already started. What happens then is that the applications are reviewed to make sure that you're eligible. You're a Montgomery County resident, you're a professional artist, etc. And all of the eligible applications are then sent to a group of individuals who are separate from our organizations. They're an unbiased third party of artists, arts administrators, and community leaders who volunteer their time to review all of the applications, evaluate them using an established scoring rubric that we'll talk a little bit about, and then make those award recommendations. And they review the applications individually for a little over a month, but then they all come together in mid to late November for a public meeting. Jordan, would you like to give a quick overview of what that meeting usually looks like?
So we basically have a very short amount of time, relatively short amount of time for each application. So each panelist is assigned certain applications to be a primary and certain to be a secondary reader on, and they will lead the discussion for those. They'll go through the rubric, which we'll see later, and they basically point out the strengths or areas where they could see improvement is needed in an application. And after the primary and the secondary reader go through and give their comments, then it is opened up for all of the panelists to make comments or to ask questions of the primary reader and secondary reader. For example, you may have not seen something or misread something, and so you can ask for clarification on those. You can make comments based on what you have seen in there. Often you'll find that the panelist will correct other panelists if they have missed something. They are very detailed in the way they look at things. We usually have between 7 and 10 minutes for each of those grants. So we give it a pretty thorough review, and I keep things moving along as best I can because I'm scared of Karen. So.
Time is of the essence, Jordan. Yes, thank you very much for that. Yes, so just to reiterate, they have about 6 weeks to read all of the applications. So by the time the panelists actually get to that public meeting, they're very familiar with the contents of the applications, especially if they're the primary reviewer or reader. But as Jordan said, the day of that meeting, we have a very tight schedule, so there isn't enough time for them to discuss each application for more than 7 to 10 minutes, as he was saying. So that day moves very quickly, but rest assured that the panelists put a lot of time in the weeks leading up to that meeting so that they know what their points are that they want to hit. And as Jordan said, it's a really intelligent, passionate group of people. And sometimes, as he said, you miss something and another panelist picks up on it. Part of the benefit of the panel process is also that each of those panelists is brought in to bring a completely different perspective. They have different professional backgrounds, and so they might interpret things in your application in a way that's different from one of the other panelists, and that can lead to some really fruitful discussions. So it's a very interesting and informative experience, and as an applicant, you're invited to attend that meeting to listen in. It can be a little intimidating, I know, for people to do that. You're listening to someone talk about something that is very, very personal and something you care about very much. So one change that we are making this year is that during the panel discussion, your name will be eliminated from the discussion. Panelists will refer to you either by a number or by a pronoun, so that it's a fairly anonymous process, at least at that public meeting, but you can still get your feedback. So we will reach out to all applicants sometime in late October to give you the final date for that panel meeting so that you can put it on your calendar if you want to attend. And then even closer to the meeting, we'll send you a tentative agenda so that you have an estimated time slot when you can tune in if you don't have time to watch the whole meeting. After that, once the panel has selected the grantees, they are approved by the Montgomery County Arts and Cultural District Board. And then once we have their approval, we start meeting with each of those individual artists to walk you through the next steps of the award process. So we'll show you your grant contract, explain all of the points in there, and get you all squared away so that starting in January, we can issue the grant payments and you can get started on your projects. Again, you have until the end of 2022 to complete the project, but each project is going to have a different start and end date that is going to be specified by you. So maybe your project's only going to take a month and you'll be done in July. Whatever the case may be, you will have a final report due 30 days after whatever that unique project end date is. All right, so that's the process in very brief form. Again, if you have questions, you can throw them in the chat. I'm going to take a little look here. Okay, I've got a couple I might get to here at the end. All right, so now let's get to the fun stuff. So Jordan mentioned that panelists are using a specific rubric when they're looking at your applications. And I think it's kind of helpful to look at the rubric before you look at the application. I always tell anybody, if you're working on a grant application of any kind, start with the rubric and look at what it is that the organization is looking for. What do they value? What's the most important thing to them? And so for this program, the scoring rubric consists of 5 main scoring areas. And all of these, again, are described in greater detail in that program guidelines document. So you can use that almost as a checklist as you're writing your application. Have I addressed this point? Have I answered this question? But to give you a quick rundown of what those areas are and what they mean, the first is artistic merit, where this is where the panelists are going to look at your work as an artist. They're going to look at work samples, and they're going to examine the quality of the proposed artistic product that you plan to create with this grant. Or if you're not creating new work, they'll look at the artistic merit maybe of the workshop instructors you're going to be learning from. But this is where they're really looking for artistic quality. The potential impact of the project is referring to the impact it's going to have on your career. So it's really important in your application that you give panelists a clear understanding of where you are in your artistic career and where you want to go next. And then you connect the dots and show them how this project is going to help you get to that next stage. Quality of the proposed project. This is kind of tying a few different factors together, but really what they're looking at here is, does it seem like it's a well thought out project? Does it seem like it's going to be meaningful for both the artist participating in it, and if it's something going to be shared with the public, does it seem like the public is going to find it meaningful as well? And that also relates to the fourth area, administrative capability. So this is where they're looking at how well you've crossed all your T's and dotted all your I's. Have you prepared a detailed project timeline? Do you have a solid budget that makes sense and is well aligned to the rest of your narrative? And does the application itself tell a clear story? So really what they're looking for here is how well organized you are, and that tells them how confident they are that you're going to be able to execute this project successfully. And the last scoring area is public benefit. So again, this is a program that is funded using public dollars. So ideally, projects are going to then impact the community in some way. Artists have approached this in a great number of ways, though, so don't get intimidated if the project you have in mind doesn't have an immediate public benefit that you've thought of yet. Some examples of what artists have done have been things like, if they were doing a professional development project to learn a new skill, sometimes they will then find an opportunity to share that skill with others. Maybe they'll lead a workshop at one of our wonderful organizations around here, like through the Dayton Society of Artists, or who knows. I won't speak for them, but that's certainly happened before. Other artists have shared the work through an exhibition, or they've published their manuscript, or they've promoted their album online, and maybe the content of the art that they're creating is really relevant to something that's happening in the community right now. So they're really helping to raise awareness and continue an important conversation in the community. So that's just to say there are a lot of different ways to approach public benefit. And we have a great partnership with the Dayton Metro Library, who works with us. So every year, once we know who those artist opportunity grantees are, Dayton Metro Library will work with you to provide access to free spaces that you can use for things like public presentations and exhibitions. They do, of course, have limited space, so you do have to kind of start that conversation with them early, but there's contact information in that program guidelines document if that's something that you would be interested in exploring.
Can I touch on administrative capabilities
Yes.
for a second? One of the things in there that we're looking at is the scope of the project and how big is the project. Have you done something this big before? Have you done something, so have you done a step before that? You know, we want to see that you're advancing your artwork, your art form as well. So if you've already produced an EP of your music and you're going to do it again, why is that different? Why is that something new for you? Why is that changing and advancing your career? If you're, I see we have a videographer in here. If you're going to produce a full-length movie, have you already done a short? Have you done something else? Because that's where the committee's looking at that administrative capability portion of it. They want to see that you've taken a few steps. And if you're brand new and you've never done anything before, you know, they take that into consideration as well when they're scoring it. So keep that in mind. That what we're looking at is going to be based on, you know, your resume, and then what are you trying to do? How are you advancing your work from there?
That's a very excellent point. Yes. So, and like Jordan said, that absolutely ties into that administrative capability, and then also that potential impact section where they're going to be looking at, you know, is this a natural next step for this artist? Absolutely. So those are the scoring areas that the panelists are looking at, but the things that they're actually evaluating are these application components. This is a kind of brief rundown of what you can expect. We're not going to cover each one of these today. I'll direct you to a few resources for things that we don't have time to cover. But what I've done is I have reached out to some of our highest scoring past grantees, and I have asked them if they would be willing to let me borrow some pieces from their applications that worked really well, so that I can show you what a model example of each one of these things looks like, so that you've got a really strong framework to build off of yourself. So the first thing that we're going to look at is the artist statement, and then a bit on the work sample and artist resume. You, of course, are going to be asked to provide a description of the opportunity. So this is where you're telling panelists who, what, when, where, and why of your project. You're going to explain the impact of the opportunity on your work, which we just kind of touched on. And again, the public benefit of it. And then the last portion of the application is where you show us your project budget and documentation of expenses. So we'll get started with the artist statement. This is one that we get quite a few questions about from artists. I think that a lot of visual artists are asked to provide artist statements for exhibition, but artists in other disciplines don't necessarily get asked to do this very frequently. So to give you an idea of what we're looking for in an artist statement, it's basically your introduction to panelists or anyone reading your application to tell them who you are as an artist, what kind of work you create, and where you want to go next in your field. Artist statements tend to be really effective if they're between about 150 and 300 words. So this is not a huge piece of writing. It's just your introduction to the world. And they tend to follow a very similar structure where they cover three main points. So they're going to talk about your aesthetic or your style as an artist. In other words, you know, what's What's the tone of your art? Do you tend to use a lot of color? Do you work in monochrome? If you're a writer, do you do really research heavy stuff, or do you write lyrical prose? Your current body of work. So you're going to tell them, what have you been working on recently, and what has kind of defined your career so far? And of course, here you're going to want to tell them the really basic details of what is your discipline, and what kinds of materials do you use to make it happen. And then you're going to share your vision for your art. So this is where you're talking about, I know where I am as an artist and I know where I want to go next. But I think it's easier to see a really effective artist statement to get an idea of how all these pieces come together. So I'm going to show you a really outstanding one. Hopefully nothing is blocking your view here. My little menu is blocking the top line. Okay, this comes from an artist, Yetunde Rodriguez, who received a grant in 2020 to complete study with the artist Amira Rahim to develop her skills in painting. And so if you take a look at this statement, there we go. So for the past 9-10 years, I have been a textile artist and designer with a focus on surface pattern design. My main medium has been relief printing through the use of block stamps that I design and carve myself. I turned my hand-printed fabric into home decor and personal accessories, such as pillows, bags, curtains, and other items. My work has been described as being joy-inducing due to the use of vibrant colors and strong abstract shapes. And then we'll go down a little bit. I've chosen to focus on the artistic integrity of my work rather than consumer products. I've been passionately learning as much as I can about painting while teaching myself how to paint. I'm eager to learn more about how to better translate the color and pattern joy in my fabrics into collectible paintings. So this statement is only about 150 words, but it checks every box that we're looking for. For one thing, she starts off telling us right away exactly what type of artist she is. She's telling us that she works in textile. Then she's talking a little bit about that aesthetic or the style, so that we can get a really clear picture of the work that she does. So she's telling us she does block printing and she uses colorful, geometric, and abstract patterns. And then, very importantly, she's ending this artistic statement by giving us kind of a snapshot of, here's where I am now, and here's where I want to go and why. And so she's explaining that her most recent body of work has been creating functional textiles that people can use in their homes, which, by the way, are beautiful. And if you aren't familiar with her work already, you should please go check her out right after this. And then she's explaining, though, that she really wants to focus on, or to shift away from consumer products and build her skills in painting so that she can start creating collectible paintings. So what Yetunde has done here is she set a very excellent stage for us to understand the rest of her application narrative. And now we have an idea of what kind of project we can expect from her. And sure enough, the project was to complete intensive painting study that's going to get her to this goal that she's describing here. It's an awesome artist statement. I'll show you one more of these. This one I edited down just a little bit because it was closer to the 250 word range, which is still within that, 150 to 350 range that we're looking for, but just to fit it on a slide in a pretty way, I cut it down. So this one is from Marcia Pippinger, who is one of our current Artist Opportunity grantees. And here she does basically the same kind of movements that Yetunde did. So she starts in her opening paragraph by explaining that she is focusing on collage, and she gives a little bit of an explanation of why she likes that medium in particular. And then she talks a bit about the themes that interest her. This is something that's really important if you're, say, a filmmaker or a writer, and you tend to create work that does surround certain themes, for visual artists too. If that's the case, and you're kind of a mission-driven artist and you have a particular area that you like to focus on, absolutely share that in your artist statement. It's a significant part of your work. So she shares with us a few of the themes that she tends to explore. And then again, she gives us a very clear description of what the work itself entails, what materials that she's using to make it. And then here we go again with a sort of goal statement. My work is expanding into new territory with what I think of as collage in 3 dimensions. And she gives even just a tiny preview of what her project actually is. It's fine if you do that. Just keep in mind that later on in the application, you'll have plenty of space to give your full project description, but it's nice to do kind of like a little lead in the way that she does here. I intend to create an art installation inside a shipping container, and with the new work, I will be layering together mirrors and mirrors in the shape of trees. So what she's doing is she's explaining, this is what collage is. It's layering things together. I want to grow as an artist, and I'm going to do it by layering materials that I haven't worked with before. So again, this is a really beautifully done artist statement, and both of these artists were very rightfully awarded funding. So the next thing that you're going to do is you're going to build upon that artist statement. That won't be the only thing that the panelists get to understand your work. You'll also have the opportunity to provide work samples, and the type of work sample will vary depending on what type of art you create, but you are allowed to provide images, video, or audio, or if you're a writer, or playwright, then you can provide a manuscript as well. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the work samples because I'll show you at the end of this, there's a page on our website where we go into quite a bit of detail about the individual requirements for these types of work samples. But a couple things, the most important takeaways I would say are that it's best if you can provide more than one. If you give one work sample, even if it's a really, outstanding work sample, sometimes panelists want to see more because they want to have a better idea of the range of the work that you do or of your evolution as an artist. So more than one is good. I would say in most cases, a handful of samples, if you're working in visual arts, is good. If you are, say, a recording artist, then maybe give us a couple of audio samples. You'll want to keep the total length of the video or audio to 6 minutes or shorter, but that at least gives you an opportunity to provide a couple of clips of songs that you've created or short excerpts of dances, things like that. And you'll also want to include at least one work sample that is from within the past year so that panelists feel like they have a deep understanding of exactly where you are right now at this point. Jordan, would you say anything else about what you like to see?
So one of the things that, especially with visual artists that we've seen that's been great is to take those work samples and put them in one document. So I love it when somebody does, oh, here's 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 of my pieces of work, but I put that in one PDF document so that I can just scroll through them, look at them, try to make sure that your quality level when you're doing these is really good, especially your audio visual. Make sure you're not compressing those very much, and so we're not getting things like that. Manuscripts, we've had some good ones. Find the best parts, of those, not just the whole thing. But yeah, the images, definitely, if you put them all in one document, that's one of my favorite things. I know it makes it easier to look at them and have them handy during the panel review process.
Yes, that's a great point. A lot of what you want to be doing as an application writer is thinking about how do I make this as easy to digest for a panelist as possible. The other thing I was going to mention on the work samples is that you have the option to upload things like images and Word documents to the application itself. But if you have something like an audio clip or a video, you also have the option to provide a link to an external website. But if you do that, make sure that you direct panelists to a public page that doesn't require a password or for them to create an account. And also keep in mind that if you're linking to a video or something that lives on a web page, make sure that that web page isn't going to change within the next couple of months, because you'll be submitting your application on October 8th, but the panelists will be reviewing it all the way through late November. So if the web page that you direct them to gets taken down in the meantime, they can't see it. There's no way for them to know what that was. So just little things to keep in mind. And then you'll provide an artist resume. So this is where you're giving them a more in-depth overview of your career as an artist. And you're going to want to focus not just on art that you've created itself, so your exhibitions and your publications, but also your involvement in the arts community. So if you've given lectures, or if you're a member of any particular arts related committees or boards, things like that, it absolutely should go in your artist resume, because it gives them the whole picture of how you're building your artistic career. This I also will not linger on, because we have a full sample of this that goes into a lot more detail on our website, and I'll show you where that lives. All right, so you've introduced yourself as an artist. We know who you are. We're excited about your work. Now we want to know, what is it that you want to do with the grant? So this is where you get into the portion of the application that is focused on the project or the opportunity itself. And the first section is very, well, intuitively called the project description. You get 500 words, and as the name suggests, this is where you're going to want to give us a lot of detail about what this project entails. What is the opportunity? When and where is it going to happen? Who's going to be involved? So if you're doing something where you're going to be studying, or you're attending a workshop, don't assume that the panelists know who these artists you're learning from are. If you're really excited because you get to work with this incredible artist in your field, give us a little bit of information about who they are and why we should be excited too, because maybe we know, but maybe we don't. And then again, why is it significant for an artist in your field? So there might be a major conference that everybody in your field wants to go to every year, but for someone who's not in your field, maybe they've never heard of it. Hard to believe, but maybe they haven't. So make sure that you explain what it is and why it's important. Jordan, do you have anything that you would say about the project description? It's a
Follow those prompts.
follow those.
I mean, follow those prompts. Those are excellent prompts. They hit all of the things that we're going to be looking for, that I would be looking for. I can't speak for every panelist, but everything I would have been looking for. Who's involved is very important. Okay. A great thing to do is to list the resume of people who are involved. So example, I'm a filmmaker and I get to work with Sylvester Stallone. Well, who's Sylvester Stallone? I mean, don't take for granted that we know who these people are. Give us the background on that information, because that adds to the other categories as well. It really hits the quality of the programming and things like that. And how is it going to really develop into your work? So we need to know their background if you're working with somebody else. And flat out tell us, why is this significant in your field? If you're going to go to, if you're a comic book artist and you're going to go to Comic-Con, how are you going to leverage that opportunity? How are you going to make something work out of that? So don't take it for granted that we're going to understand, or we're going to make those connections. Literally make them, spell them out to us, and tell us why it's important and why it's going to impact you and your career.
Excellent. Yes, and there is a section where if your opportunity is specifically to study with a mentor, there is a section where you can upload a letter of acceptance or invitation from that individual or organization. So if it's something that you've already secured, then you can show us that. And as Jordan said, if you want to share their resume and their professional background, that's extremely helpful. You could consider using, some of that word count in your project description to give a brief bio statement. You could also attach their full resume later in the application, or you could even include a link in the project narrative that will take them directly to a page where they can see that person's resume. We do allow links in the application. I always say use them effectively. So you don't want to have, a dozen or more links in an application, because if you're sending panelists in too many directions, they might get confused and lost. But if you throw one in here and there, it can be very effective. And then you're also going to get a narrative section, also 500 words. You don't have to use all of them, but you get at least that many to describe the project's impact on your career. And so again, this is just building off of that same description, but you're going to go into more detail about what exactly you think that you're going to gain from the experience and how you're going to use that new knowledge or that new skill moving forward. If it's a prestigious opportunity that's going to open doors for you, absolutely tell us that, because again, we might not necessarily know that the exhibition you've been invited to participate in is nationally known, and it's a complete game changer. So don't be shy about sharing that. That's definitely important.
For instance, if you're a visual artist and you get invited to participate in Prix de West, there are a lot of people, especially outside of the visual arts field, that aren't going to know what Prix de West is. It is the best, the highest sales, the biggest collection of Western artists in the United States. And so you want to spell that out for people. You want to give us that opportunity. If their webpage is already active, you can link to it, those kind of things. The only other thing I would say is, what is the opportunity? Always brings up an interesting thing in my head, and Karen might go into this later, but what is an opportunity? Opportunities can be self-created. So it can be, I'm going to do a show during this time period. I'm going to create this amount of work during this time period. It can be an invitation. I was invited to participate in this, but I need to create work for it. I can apply for this opportunity, this work, so I'm a videographer, and I'm going to apply to Sundance to try to get into Sundance, but I need to make the video. One of the things that we ask frequently is, why now? So keep that in mind. Like, I'm going to create a web page. Somebody asked a question about that. I'm going to create a web page. Why now? Why does that impact you? Why is that opportunity for you now? How do you leverage that to impact your career now? So just keeping that in mind, opportunities can be self-created. That's perfectly fine. But why now becomes the question.
Very good. Yes. And building off of that, a very frequently asked question is, what happens if I might have an opportunity, but I won't know for sure until later? That's okay. So the most common example of this is an artist wants to apply for funding so that they can participate in a workshop or a residency that's happening in 2022, but they won't know until January or February or whenever the case may be whether or not they've been accepted. So what happens in that instance is that you can still apply for the grant, but you'll indicate in your application when you anticipate you will find out whether or not you've been accepted. And then if the panel decides to award your project funding, we give what's called a contingency award, which means that we just hold on to the grant funds and we wait until you get that acceptance letter. And then once you send us that acceptance letter, then we initiate that awards process. So that probably will come into play for many applicants. It does every year, so don't worry about it. Just ask if you have any concerns, but typically we can make that work. Okay, mysterious picture of a rendering of a shipping container. So along with that, along with that project description, we're going to ask you for a project timeline. And this seems pretty straightforward, but there are a couple of things we've noticed that work extremely well. So once again, I have borrowed from a couple really outstanding applicants so that you can see crystal clear examples of what makes for a good project timeline. You can probably guess, based on what we've already said so far, that the most important thing is that it's clear and it's thorough. So you're going to show us how this project is going to happen from start to finish. So here's an example from grantee I mentioned before, Marcia Pippinger. This is her timeline for the project to create an art installation inside a shipping container. And you can see a couple of things that you should absolutely, steal from this. She's given sort of bullet points, rather than writing it in paragraph form, which is fine. She's made it extremely easy to read, and she's given just brief descriptions of what each step of the project is going to look like so that we can see exactly when the work is going to start and we can see when it's going to wrap up. And she gives us a little bit of information about each of those various steps. This is a really beautiful way to format a timeline. It's not intimidating. It doesn't need to be a masterwork of literature. It's really just about making it, like Jordan said earlier, easy for the panelists to read and digest. But I'm going to show you what is kind of, I think, the creme de la creme of project timelines that at least I have seen. And I'm going to preface it by saying that this is not something that you need to do. You don't need to feel that this is like what we expect from timelines, but just to show you a really effective way of doing it. This is from an artist, Zachary Kalapi, who applied, let's see, he's, yes, 2021. So he's one of our most recent grantees. And this was his project timeline. And you can see that he broke it into phases. I cut it off because there were actually 6 phases here. But within each phase of the project, he then further broke it down into a set of goals. So he had studio goals. In other words, during this month, this is what I need to be doing in my art making space. And then he had professional goals. So when it came to the administrative aspects of the project, things like when to write and send out the press release, when to order flyers, those kinds of things, he split them out to make it really easy for us and for him to see at a glance what he needed to get done in every phase of this project. And I'll say, I don't think he would mind me mentioning this, that for Zachary, this opportunity was to launch his first solo exhibition. So he demonstrated that he was a professional artist. He has formal education in his field. He had participated in group exhibitions before, but he wanted to create a solo exhibition that was very ambitious. It was going to involve a lot of found materials, creating fairly large scale sculptural works using, he ended up building a pond in Front Street. So that gives you an idea. This was an ambitious project. And I remember the panelists, when they discussed it, they all noted that. They said, this is an ambitious project, especially for a first solo exhibition. But the fact that we can see that he has put this much thought into how it's going to happen tells us that he's going to pull it off, and he absolutely did. It was open earlier this year, and it was magical. So again, your project timeline doesn't need to be this detailed. It might not make sense for the type of project that you're doing, but this is a really awesome example of how to organize.
Your project timeline might need to be that detailed, though. So in Zach's case, this was a new thing for him. And in order to show the administrative capabilities, to show that he was going to be able to do, he had mentioned in his artist resume, he had mentioned that he does the found materials. There were a lot of moving parts in what he was telling us he was going to do. Without a timeline like this, that might have impacted his administrative capabilities. If you are a filmmaker, your timeline's probably going to include more things than if you're an artist, a visual artist. And as a visual artist, Marcia's was a great example because she's going to have the materials. Okay, it's not that hard to go out and collect those materials, to order them from Dick Blick, to do those things. But in his case, it's much more difficult. So that does play into it. It makes a big difference. And keep that in mind. Your timeline is going to reflect your capabilities and your ability to do that. So this plays a big part in those administrative capability scores.
Absolutely. And also think of it not as something that's you know, again, I don't want people to be intimidated. Think of this as a tool that you're creating for yourself. It's not just for the panel to look at. This is your guide now, you know, so you have a solid plan in place and you can make it happen. I will just add that I had to cut it off, but phase 5 of this under studio goals included don't break anything, which I thought was wonderful. So one of your final bits of supporting documentation that you're going to be asked to provide is a project budget. Now, I am a writer, and so whenever I hear anything about math, I get a little intimidated, but I don't want that for you. So we're going to walk through what the project needs to be and why it's really not scary. First of all, we give you a template to work with. So this is your project budget template. It's an Excel spreadsheet that actually has formulas set so that when you type things into these spaces, it will auto sum at the bottom and everything. So you don't have to, there's not a whole lot that you need to do here. But basically what you're going to do is thinking about your project and everything that you want to complete. You're going to put together your list of everything that you need to pay for. And then you're going to organize that list into basically 6 categories. So fees, so that might be something like a registration fee if it's to participate in an event. Presentation costs. So if you are preparing a work for exhibition and you need something like frames, then that could go under presentation costs. Services and rental. You need to hire an editor or you need to rent a particular kind of equipment. Materials and supplies, that could be any number of things. I'm sure you can imagine what that would be for you, but of course things like pens, paper, paint, all of that. Equipment, again, as long as it's under $500, you are allowed to have some small equipment expenses that you can use the Artist Opportunity Grant funds for. And then travel. So if you need to travel, this includes flights, mileage, and also your lodging. So if you're staying in an Airbnb or a hotel, you can include that here. In the second column, you're going to give a brief description of what you're including in each of these areas. And then in column A, B, and C, you're going to do the breakdown showing where those dollars are coming from. So here's an example of a fully completed budget spreadsheet. This was from George Drake Jr., who a couple of years ago used an Artist Opportunity Grant to create an original podcast called Fifth and Ludlow about a local mystery involving a letter hidden beneath a bathtub in a historic home. And you should check that out as well at fifithandludlowpodcast.com. George Drake is extremely organized, so his budget spreadsheet was very straightforward. In fees, he needed to pay some fees for the audio editing of the podcast, as well as to commission an original theme song, those catchy tunes that play at the beginning of your favorite podcasts. He wanted one of those. He had some website hosting costs. So what Jordan was mentioning before, that whole idea of I need a web page, well, this wasn't for general use. This was specifically a website where this podcast was going to live. So he included 1 year of hosting it for the purposes of this project. He wanted to do a listening party at launch, so he had some space rental costs. And then I'll point out, so you'll see most of this so far has been in the Artist Opportunity Grant funds, but we get to food and drink for the listening party. You'll see that that is in the applicant's funds. That's because refreshments for events are not an eligible expense that you can use grant funds for. So that's one of those things that you'll want to be checking those guidelines documents carefully as you're putting all of this together to make sure everything's eligible. So rightly so, he said, I'm going to cover those expenses myself. And then lastly, he had some fees to enter the podcast into different competitions so that he could promote it and get the word out about it. And you'll just want to make sure, again, most of these now I believe will actually auto total but you just want to make sure that if you're requesting $2,500, that column B, Artist Opportunity Grant Fund, says $2,500. One thing I'll note here is that, again, you can request up to $3,000 through this grant program, but your project, your overall project budget is allowed to be higher than that. So say you have a project that's going to be $4,500, you're going to request 3,000 of these grant funds, and then you're going to show us where the remaining dollars are going to come from. So you want to put the entire project budget in here, just like George has done. So his total project is $3,650. 2,500 of that is grant funding, and then he's going to cover the remainder. One change that we did make 2 cycles ago is that if your total project is $6,000 or more, in other words, if it's twice the maximum grant amount possible, in that case, you have to also prove that you do have additional funding in place. And the reason for that is because occasionally we get projects that are of a pretty large scope. And so we want to make sure that an artist isn't getting into a position where they're going to be, scrambling to make up the difference to execute on a very large project. So if it's more than $6,000 total, then we're going to ask for something like a letter from a foundation, or proof that you have a scholarship, or something that you can apply to support these grants or support the project. But the thing that really set George's budget documentation apart here was the way that he then provided his documentation of each of these expenses. So you'll provide your budget spreadsheet, and then you're going to show us in more detail what those expenses are. So I'm going to navigate to a new page. Do you see Fifth and Ludlow documentation now, Jordan? Okay, great. All right, so this is the expense documentation that he provided. And again, just to show you kind of like, this is like the best way to do this. He's put all of it into one document, and he's given each of the pages a header. So he goes right back to all of those categories from the budget spreadsheet, starting with fees. And then he reminds us that when he's talking about fees, he's referring to the editor's fees and the licensing fees for the music. And then he goes through and he provides some quotes that he's gotten from the vendors so that we can see where those numbers are coming from. Same thing with presentation. So he's using some of those grant dollars to support this website hosting. So he shows us how much that's going to cost. And you can see he has a variety of different types of documentation. So some of these are quotes, some of them are emails. And then a little bit later, so this is a cost sheet showing the venue rental that he can anticipate. Going into more detail about that. And then a little bit later, he's going to show some screenshots from websites that talk more about these national contests that he's planning to submit to. So you can use all different kinds of documentation in this, but this is like a really great example because he's pulling from email, quotes, websites, but he's organizing all of it in a way that the panelists don't have to, they don't have 20 documents in front of them and they're trying to figure out, does this one go to this budget spreadsheet item? He lays it all out in such a clear and easy to follow way. It's really, really well done.
Back of your costs.
Yes.
If they're in your budget, we want to know where that number came from. That goes to the administrative capabilities as well, as well as your ability to pull this off. If you're saying, I want to make a 10-piece exhibit, just because somebody asked that in there, we better see that you're buying 10 canvases or 10 boards or 10, we want to know. We also want to look at, when you talk about you have an opportunity, your public benefit portion of it, how are you getting people to this? You know, how are you? So if it's a self-curated exhibit at the Dayton Public Library, have you included any cost for postage, for maybe postcards or anything like that? Think about all of those aspects of it and try to include them in the budget so that when we look back at administrative capabilities, it all ties together. We see that you've thought this out from top to bottom. Those of us who are arts administrators, this is what we do for a living. You know, we play with budgets and we're looking at the full scope of an event. And are you able to actually pull that off with what you're telling us? If you've left things out, that does impact it. His budget is fantastic. I mean, even if it's an email, even if it's whatever. Another thing that can also help in here is a few pages up in that document, he had mentioned he was working with this editor or that editor. If there's a link somewhere that links to their bio so that we can see who they are and know who they are. Because again, you're working with these people. We want to know what their quality level is, because that helps us ascertain whether the program quality is going to be good or not.
Yes, and if you and of course we know that sometimes these projects you're not planning on starting them for a few months. You're waiting to find out if you receive grant funding to start things off. But most vendors and other people that you're going to work with will understand that. So just reach out to them and say, hey, I'm applying for a grant and they want to see proof of how much it's going to cost if we do this. And then they will give you what's called a quote. And it's fine if it's an email. Sometimes people will put it in a more formal format, the way a couple of his vendors and collaborators did. But yep, just like Jordan said, just document those expenses and show us where those dollars are going. All right. While we're on this website, if I can, I'm going to, I can't see because of the, sorry. My Zoom menu is blocking me. There we go. Okay. Fantastic. So I told you that there are a couple of resources that live elsewhere that we won't go over in detail because you can refer to them at your leisure. But they live on our CultureWorks website, cultureworks.org. And if you go here to the Apply for Funding menu button, and then this is going to take you to a page with all of the funding opportunities we have. So you can either click on Artist Opportunity Grant or just scroll down. And here you are, now accepting applications through October 8th. This is where you can find links to the full grant guidelines document that I mentioned a couple of times, that timeline that we went over, and resources for applicants. So this has a section that's called Tips for Writing a Great Application. And it doesn't go over everything that we talked about today, but it does go into more detail about that artistic resume that I mentioned. And this is where you can download that sample artist resume so that you can see what to include there. And it gives you some pointers on things to keep in mind. It also gives you this link if you want to learn more about work samples and what we are expecting. Boom, work sample guidelines. And this is also, I believe, linked directly from the application. So as you're writing the application, you can refer back to this as well. And that's where it's going to explain, you know, depending on the type of work sample, some things to keep in mind. So again, all of that is on that Apply for Funding page under Artist Opportunity Grants, under Resources for Applicants. And just beside that, we have evaluation criteria and process. And this is where you can also find this in the program guidelines, but it lives here as well. This is where you can look at all of those scoring criteria that I mentioned. So again, keep this by your side as you're writing your application and just, you know, treat it kind of like a checklist and make sure that you're covering all of the points that the panelists are going to be looking for. And then the link to the application itself is just down here. It says apply now. And it's going to take you to an external page. We use a software called Community Force. So this is where you'll be applying. If you click apply, You can either log back in if you already have an account, or you can create a new one. And it's pretty straightforward from there. Let's see. Let me take a second here to check, because I did see some questions coming in. Can we do multiple applications? Great question. Simple answer, no. You have to limit yourself to one application per grant cycle. And you also have to limit your application to one project. So you can't submit an application that has, a couple different options for projects. It should be one project and one application per cycle.
Can I clarify on that? So
Mhm.
somebody had asked later, and I already answered this one, but if their projects tie together, for example, they're going to create a 10-piece exhibit and they want to create a website to help display that, yes, that is acceptable. So that's not really different projects. It's just one project that has multiple components. So
Yes.
you can do that. You can't do multiple projects. I'm going to do this exhibition and this exhibit. No,
Yes.
one exhibition.
Precisely. Let's see. So someone asked whether if you do a lot of work in Montgomery County, but you're not a Montgomery County resident, are you eligible? And unfortunately, no. You do have to be a resident of Montgomery County in order to apply for the funding.
Karen, somebody asked about if the finances run through their corporation, does that impact their ability?
So we wouldn't allow the finances to run through your company. You would have to apply as an individual. We do know that there are a lot of artists who are also small business owners, and that's fantastic. But for this program, the money has to be going to you as an individual. Awesome.
And somebody asked about if they're looking for a piece of equipment that's more than 500, can they request 500 toward that piece of equipment, and the rest they fund themselves?
I think so, but maybe I should.
Yeah, I didn't have that answer either, so I didn't.
Yeah, that's an interesting nuance to that. Let's see. I'm going to make a note of that one, and then we don't have a name associated to you, so I will put my email address in the chat, and anyone whose questions we didn't get to or didn't have answers for in this case, follow up with me, kmainer@cultureworks.org, and I will get an answer for you on that.
My initial leaning on that is they're going to frown upon it. Because if your piece of equipment is more than $500, they're going to expect that that's going to be a continued use piece of equipment. And for the purposes of these grants, they really prefer you to rent that equipment for the project rather than if your rental, suppose you're a cinematographer and you need to rent a camera and it costs you $2,000 to rent this piece of equipment for 7 days to do your filming. They would rather you rent that piece of equipment for $2,000 than go out and buy that equipment. It's just the way the grant is written, so that they're not supplying continued use. For example, if I need a MacBook to create something digital, they don't want to fund the MacBook either. They want to fund the project. You can pay somebody else to do whatever you were going to do on the MacBook. Suppose I was going to use it for graphic design so that I could create postcards. There's not a loophole in there that lets you buy the MacBook so that you can create those postcards. They'll let you pay another designer to create those, but they don't want to fund that MacBook. And then the only other one that I didn't have an answer for, if the project concludes with an exhibition in the first few months of 2023, but the work is being done in 2022, does the project qualify for the current period?
Yeah, this is another kind of nuanced one. So technically the way the guidelines are phrased, it's okay if the project has started before the grant activities period, which is that January through December timeline, as long as it concludes within that timeline. But I would say if the focus of the grant application, if your project is to create the work, and that part is going to be completed in 2022, and you're going to use all of the grant funds within 2022, I think that's okay. You might just have to indicate in that public benefits section, I do plan to exhibit, but it's not going to happen until after the grant activities end date, and you wouldn't be able to use any grant funds for that portion of the project, if that makes sense.
So shipping your artwork to the exhibition in 2023, not covered. Don't put that in your grant. It can be in your grant, but it has to be outside. It has to be funds you're providing, not funds you're requesting.
Yeah.
Make sure you've spent all of the money by the end of 2022.
Yep.
That's
awesome questions. We are 1 minute over time, so I won't hold you much longer, but I do want to give one quick plug. If you are looking for more resources to learn about how to build your career as an artist, there is an upcoming opportunity provided by an organization called Launch Dayton. They're separate from us, but I'm giving them a plug here. They do an annual event called Startup Week here in Dayton. It's a totally free week-long conference for movers, shakers, makers, entrepreneurs. And this year they have asked CultureWorks to collaborate with them to curate a special arts track for artists and creatives. So Startup Week is September 13th through 16th. And on September 15th, which is Wednesday that week, we're going to have a special arts track where you can learn from many amazing artists and speakers in our community about a variety of topics that will probably tie into your work as artists. So it is happening at the Dayton Arcade. The arts track will be in the beautiful contemporary Dayton, which if you haven't been yet, this is an awesome opportunity to come. It's also going to be available online. So if you would prefer to tune in virtually, you can do that as well. You just register online and they'll get you all hooked up with the app that you need. But some of the topics, as I said, they're probably going to be relevant to a lot of people in the audience today. First up, art is my day job, talking to a group of awesome and probably familiar to many of you artists who have made their careers in art. They're going to talk about the great parts, the not so great parts, imposter syndrome. We'll see what happens. They're a fantastic group, so it's going to be wonderful. Getting funded as an artist. This is a panel of individuals who have been awarded artist opportunity grants in the past and who have also, many of them, received Ohio Arts Council grants. So they're going to be talking about some of the things that they've learned in pursuing funding for their work as artists. So that's an awesome resource for you as well. Paperwork for the creative entrepreneur. So this is talking about what kinds of tax documents do you need in place to go after certain types of opportunities. It's gonna that's a very highly requested topic. So we're thrilled that Emerald Sparks is going to talk to it. And then lastly, how to build your audience. So thinking about how you want to get your work out there as an artist, there are so many different approaches that you can take. So we have pulled together a fabulous panel of artists who can speak to a number of those ways. So again, this is Launch Dayton Startup Week, September 13th through 16th. Tune in September 15th for all of these awesome arts talks, or maybe I'll see you at the Dayton Arcade if you come live. But otherwise, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'll just give you a final reminder. We are accepting applications now through October 8th. That means you can submit right up until 11:59 that night. So if you have any questions between now and then, I did put my email address in the chat there. So please, please, please feel free to reach me at any time. I really do want to help you on this next step of your career, and I will answer any and all questions that I can. And if I can't answer them, I will find the answers. So please, please reach out. Jordan, any last words?
take advantage of Karen as a resource for this. don't hesitate to get something done and make sure that you get it checked. Have somebody else read it that's not familiar with your work and have them ask questions. I mean, these grants are not super complex to apply for, but there are details that we need inside of them to accurately score them and make sure we're giving you the best opportunity to succeed. So, but yeah, answer the prompts. That's my big thing. This is a well-designed grant application. It's been fine-tuned every year, to the point where if you answer those prompts and you answer them fully, you're going to do well. You're going to score well. One year we had somebody that just wanted to tell us what they were doing in every single area. That doesn't work. We really need you to answer the questions. So
Yes, indeed. Wise words, panel chair / facilitator. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for, again, taking your afternoon and spending it with us. I hope that you are healthy, safe, and dry wherever you are, and that you and your loved ones are doing well. And I hope to talk to you soon and learn more about what you're planning to create in the coming year. Bye, everybody.